If you're listening to this, you're probably well aware of, the core paradox of Canadian foreign policy for the last 30 years.
Mm-hmm. The luxury of assuming geopolitics was optional.
Exactly. And our sources for this deep dive are making it very, very clear. That era of strategic comfort, especially now under the Mark Carney government, is definitively over, painfully over.
That's really the essential starting point for all of this. We're not looking at policy preferences today. What we're doing is a hard, realist assessment of Canada's structural dilemma.
Okay, so what's the mission for us today?
The mission is to unpack this collision of structural dependency, and by that I mean fundamentally relying on the United States with just rising global disorder. The core takeaway from all the material is that Canada is operating with an excess of obligations relative to its power and fiscal capacity.
That phrase, excess of obligations, is so important because it leads to an unavoidable trade-off that is going to dominate policy for the rest of this decade.
You simply can't do everything.
You can't. Canada cannot simultaneously preserve its welfare state, meet these aggressively expanded NATO commitments, secure the Arctic, and successfully diversify trade away from the U.S.
And pursue a huge energy transformation on top of all that.
Right. Attempting all five, our sources argue, guarantees one of two things: either material decline or acute political instability.
So it forces a zero-sum calculation. The question for policymakers, and for you listening, is no longer what Canada wants to do. It's about what vulnerabilities it has to strategically accept. Where do you start cutting?
So let's start where all grand strategy has to: public finance. I mean, the best geopolitical intentions in the world just die the moment you open the budget ledger.
They really do.
And when we look at the government's 2025-26 budget projections, the whole foundation for any new strategy looks incredibly fragile.
It does. I mean, the headline number is the projected deficit, $78.3 billion for this fiscal year.
So it's clocking in at 2.5% of GDP.
Which is already a massive number. But the real structural worry isn't even the deficit itself. It's the cost of just maintaining the existing debt.
Exactly. The federal debt to GDP ratio is projected to stay north of 43% all the way through 2029-30. But the number that really gets me is the cost of simply servicing that debt, the interest payments.
Yeah.
Public debt charges are expected to rise from $55.6 billion this year to $76.1 billion by 2029-30.
And to put that in perspective for everyone, those rising debt charges will hit 2.1% of GDP. That's a level we just haven't seen in over 2 decades, not since 2007.
And that money it's purely interest. It funds no schools, no hospitals, no soldiers. It's just gone.
Right.
And here's where the numbers get, really political. We went through the assessment from the PBO, the Parliamentary Budget Officer.
Nonpartisan referees.
They are. And they assess the likelihood of the government actually meeting its own stated goal, its fiscal anchor of a declining deficit to GDP ratio.
And what's fascinating here is that the PBO concludes there is only a 7.5% probability of hitting that anchor.
7.5%. Just think about that.
I mean, that's less like a prudent target and more like an aspiration that is, statistically almost impossible.
So it means the political consensus around the budget is built on this very unstable premise. If the government fails to meet its anchor, which the PBO says they likely will, it just severely limits Canada's fiscal elasticity.
The ability to raise taxes or take on more debt without a crisis.
Yeah. In simple terms, the cushion for dealing with unexpected global shocks or for financing these ambitious new plans is completely gone.
And that scarcity forces a reevaluation of how we even talk about spending. The government loves using the language of investment, but as our sources point out, defense spending, health spending for an aging population, they're non-productive in macroeconomic terms.
They're absolutely socially necessary.
Oh, of course. Security necessary.
Yeah.
But they are consumption. They're security insurance. They don't generate returns that pay down the debt.
So you have a state trying to dramatically increase these necessary but non-productive expenditures defense, health fall, while struggling with high household debt, modest growth, and this severe fiscal constraint.
Yeah. The inability to finance these necessary programs really sets the stage for all the impossible strategic choices that come next.
And those fiscal constraints become immediately painful when you turn to security obligations, which have just exploded.
Right. The huge pressure point here is NATO. Following the June 2025 summit in The Hague, the alliance adopted a brand new, incredibly aggressive target.
5% of GDP for defense spending by 2035.
This commitment is a game changer. It's structured as 3.5% for core defense and then another 1.5% specifically for resilience and infrastructure.
The implication of meeting that goal is just staggering. It means defense expenditures would need to exceed $150 billion a year by 2035.
That's nearly 3 times current spending levels, a near tripling.
And we should remember, our sources point out that even the old, less ambitious path toward the 2% target was already projected to push the deficit to GDP ratio past the 1% threshold the government had set.
So the 5% goal doesn't just stretch the budget. It fundamentally requires restructuring the Canadian state, fiscally and politically.
But here's the critical point, the strategic divergence. Canada faces two fundamentally competing geographic imperatives.
It does. One is the NATO requirement to contribute meaningfully to the eastern flank against Russia. The other is securing its own north.
And the government is putting serious money toward the Arctic, right? There's $6 billion for that Arctic over-the-horizon radar program with Australia, plus another $420 million for enhanced Arctic operations.
Yes, acknowledging the hybrid threats from Russia and China.
So my question is, doesn't that 1.5% resilience part of the new NATO target actually help bridge this gap?
That's a great question, but our sources are pretty skeptical. While the resilience budget could be used for dual-use Arctic infrastructure like, say, climate-resilient northern broadband, the missions are still competing for limited people, limited equipment, and limited attention. Canada cannot be a full-spectrum NATO contributor and a credible Arctic power at the same time without a massive budget increase that the PBO says is almost impossible.
So it's a direct trade-off. Could you give us an example of that?
Sure. Look at Operation Reassurance in Latvia. Its renewal and expansion require $2.7 billion in funding over several years.
Okay.
That is $2.7 billion that is then unavailable for critical Arctic infrastructure or for icebreakers or for those foundational resilience investments we were just talking about.
So every dollar spent reinforcing the eastern flank is a dollar not spent securing Canadian sovereignty in the north.
Exactly. And this leads us directly to what the 2025 Nunavut Arctic Security Summit strategy called the sovereignty paradox. The contradiction is stark.
What is it?
Canada can fly air patrols over the remote Beaufort Sea, showcasing this theoretical sovereignty, but it cannot guarantee high-speed internet or reliable infrastructure in Nunavut.
So its hard power is detached from the soft systemic needs of its own territory.
That's it, perfectly.
Okay, let's pivot from these huge structural commitments to active foreign policy under constraint. Let's start with Ukraine. Canada's shown a massive commitment here.
A huge commitment.
Over $23.5 billion since the invasion. Forbes Ukraine even named Canada Ukraine's top friend in 2025.
Yeah, the commitment has been substantial, particularly on a per capita basis. That includes over $12 billion in direct financial support. But the nature of that support evolved.
Evolved because of the changing dynamics in the U.S.
Precisely. Specifically, the dramatic reduction in direct U.S. military assistance under the second Trump administration.
So the Carney government had to find a way to maintain its principled support for Ukraine without hollowing out its own, fiscally constrained military.
Precisely. They adopted what our sources call calibrated restraint. So instead of endless direct grants and military transfers that empty domestic stockpiles,
Which they don't have enough of anyway.
Right. They shifted towards sophisticated financial engineering. For 2025-26, this included $2.5 billion in things like loan guarantees and debt service suspension.
So it's support that looks massive on paper but limits the immediate fiscal hit at home.
Exactly. And they leaned into the one comparative advantage that wasn't tied to massive capital expenditure expertise. Operation Unifier trained over 47,000 Ukrainian personnel.
That's sustainable and valuable, and it plays to Canada's strengths while, sidestepping the challenge that the DND has, just spending its capital budget sufficiently.
Absolutely. It's a very smart calculation born of necessity. Now, this brings us to the biggest structural constraint of all.
United States.
Economic dependence on the United States. And this relationship became acutely politicized, especially when the second Trump administration began threatening sweeping tariffs.
And even making those remarks about annexing Canada and repeatedly calling Prime Minister Carney governor.
The rhetoric was intense. It framed the Canadian April 2025 election as practically a referendum on how to handle the U.S. relationship.
But isn't accepting this managed dependency just inherently risky under such a volatile administration? Doesn't that just codify your own vulnerability?
That is the ultimate realist dilemma.
Yeah.
While defiant rhetoric plays well politically, and, it should, It can't fundamentally alter the reality that Canada occupies a subordinate position in the North American system.
Geographically and economically subordinate.
Absolutely. Efforts to diversify, like joining the EU's SAFE initiative, the Security Action for Europe, are prudent, yes, but they cannot fundamentally change that North American structural system.
So you're saying that the search for what you call illusory autonomy is actually more dangerous than accepting managed dependency.
From a hard realist perspective, yes. I mean, any attempt at a grand trade reorientation, say, dramatically re-engaging China for economic stability, would instantly trigger U.S. scrutiny and retaliation in sensitive sectors.
So the strategic choice is more about pragmatic incrementalism. Insulate critical ties where you can, accept the structural reality, and just avoid costly symbolic battles that Canada simply cannot win.
That's the calculation.
That structural reality also weighs heavily on the domestic economy. Let's look at energy infrastructure, specifically the Trans Mountain Expansion, TMX. It became fully operational in May 2024, which was a major achievement in terms of moving resources. But the fiscal legacy of that project it's terrifying.
Terrifying is the right word. The final price tag ballooned to $34.2 billion.
So think about that. The original estimate was $5.4 billion.
6 times the cost.
That's not a budget overrun. That's like buying 5 extra pipelines that somehow just vanished.
Is there any other national project in recent memory that failed so dramatically?
It's historic. And while the corporation technically reports operational profitability today, once you factor in the $23 billion in debt the government had to convert to equity, the cost to taxpayers is immense.
How immense.
Our analysis suggests the government incurred an estimated before-tax loss of $166 million in just the first half of 2025.
So taxpayers are essentially on the hook for potentially subsidizing oil shipments by up to $18.8 billion over the project's life. That's the long-term risk. It's a colossal loss that fundamentally restricts future infrastructure spending.
And yet, despite this massive failure, the Carney government and Alberta reached an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, in November 2025 that commits to building new pipeline capacity of at least 1 million barrels a day.
And this is where the debate becomes more symbolic than strategic. The market fundamentals just don't support this rush.
Really?
The global oil market is forecast to have a major surplus of 4 million barrels per day in 2026. Plus, existing incremental expansions, TMX optimization and Enbridge's own increases, could likely accommodate the expected growth of Western Canadian crude.
Which is what, about 500,000 to 600,000 barrels per day?
Exactly. So the push for new pipeline capacity isn't driven by immediate market need.
No, it's a proxy. It's a tool for managing volatile regional identity and political relations between Ottawa and the energy provinces. It's not a clear-eyed economic assessment.
It shows the government has to dedicate precious capital toward appeasing political fault lines instead of solely strategic needs.
Now, let's shift to the final domestic constraint, the welfare state. Canada's social model was built on assumptions that are just collapsing.
Low defense burdens, favorable demographics.
All gone. Program expenses are extremely high, projected at 16.5% of GDP in 2025-26, largely driven by aging populations and inevitable health costs.
This creates that ultimate zero-sum fiscal environment we mentioned at the very top. You have dramatically rising defense spending, aiming toward that 5% of GDP target colliding head-on with demographic-driven health and pension costs.
You cannot expand both indefinitely.
Something has to give.
And we've already seen what gave way. The Carney government suspended the consumer carbon tax and paused the electric vehicle sales mandate.
Right. Our source analysis views this as a reluctant acknowledgement of the political limits to climate policy when immediate fiscal and cost of living pressures are so severe.
Precisely. Environment and Climate Change Canada estimates that following these reversals, the country will fall well short of its 2030 climate goal.
They'll reach only about halfway to the target reduction below 2005 levels. When resources are constrained, security and economic stability, the immediate pressures, will always trump longer-term sustainability commitments.
So given all these impossible fiscal and strategic pressures, the thinking about sovereignty itself is changing dramatically. It's shifting from patrols and symbolic gestures to systemic resilience.
That is the core strategic pivot. And in the Arctic, this is the clearest. Sovereignty isn't challenged by a conventional tank column anymore.
No.
It's challenged by cyber intrusions against northern broadband, by disinformation campaigns eroding social cohesion, or, most practically, by permafrost collapse neutralizing critical runways.
These are the soft underbellies of Canadian security.
And they are cheap for adversaries to execute, but incredibly expensive for Canada to fix and defend against. Sovereignty is now defined by the state's ability to endure disruption without breaking.
And this brings us back to that new NATO 5% commitment, which we might view cynically, but which actually offers a necessary hook. The 1.5% specifically earmarked for infrastructure and resilience provides a framework for dual-use investment in the North that Canada has struggled to justify purely on domestic grounds.
So we're talking about building broadband networks, redundant energy grids, airstrips that are designed to withstand climate change realities like permafrost thaw.
Right. The resilience imperative demands that kind of systemic investment, and NATO provides the fiscal and strategic cover for it.
Ultimately, the conclusion drawn in this deep dive is sober, but it's essential. Canada won't face a simple choice between success and failure. It's going to be a series of harsher decisions about which vulnerabilities it is willing to accept.
And the government's actions, suspending the carbon tax, pivoting toward capital formation, they demonstrate a reluctant but necessary recognition that not all priorities can be pursued simultaneously.
So what does this all mean?
The concluding thesis here is powerful. States decline not because they lack ideals, but because they refuse to rank them. The task ahead for the Carney government isn't to expand Canada's role on the world stage, but to consolidate it under severe fiscal constraint. Prudent retrenchment is the necessary action to avoid this crippling intersection of fiscal exhaustion, political division, and strategic overextension.
So the question for Canada is whether the political incentive, the demands from the electorate for both a large welfare state and global influence, will ever align with this strategic necessity.
Or will the illusion of unlimited options just persist until reality imposes choices that are far harsher than prudent ranked planning would ever require? That's something for you to mull over as you consider how a nation balances its deeply held ideals against the cold, hard reality of its budget.